Amen. Aren't you glad that we have a God who is sovereign and in control, and that we can rest in Him? We can be still and know that He is God. Good morning. Luke chapter 16. Go ahead and open your Bibles to the Gospel of Luke. We are back and we are in Luke and settled in well there. We were in chapter 15 for the last few weeks, and now we're in chapter 16. And our topic, as you will see from the cover of the listening guide, our series, is money. Now, why would we talk about money at a time like this? And the answer is because we're following through the gospel ministry, the earthly ministry of the Lord Jesus Christ, and He's talking about money. And so we're here to share His Word, and we're sharing it in the order that it was recorded by Luke. And so we are in Luke chapter 16, and we're studying a parable today that has caused a great deal of confusion, because while it is indeed the parable of the steward, it is the parable of the dishonest steward, or the parable of the unjust steward. And so what I want us to do is to go back and read through the text. Now, we'll read through the text with commentary to make sure that we understand exactly, or to the extent that we can, or that I can explain it, what is being said. We're going to take 3 weeks to go through chapter 16, hopefully just 3 weeks. This week, of course, we're looking at the role of money, or the role of generosity, how we deal with money in evangelism and our call to make disciples. Next week, we'll look at some very clear teaching and principles in Scripture on godliness and greed and what God's Word has to say about that. And then we will close this series focusing upon the parable of the rich man and Lazarus that's found at the end of the chapter. So let's read through the text. We're reading 1 through 13 of Luke chapter 16. With me interrupting for comments along the way, so bear with me, all right? And he, who is he? Jesus, said to the disciples. Now, we have a different audience here than we had in chapter 15. In chapter 15, we had the sinners and the tax collectors, and then we had the scribes and the Pharisees who are grumbling. Here he's talking to those people who are clearly identified as those who are following after him, his disciples. There was, he goes on to say, a rich man, which, of course, we just finished a parable about a rich man. The rich man who had the two sons, the prodigal son that ran away and the prodigal son who stayed home. But this rich man had a manager. And again, as Oregon has already introduced, we're talking about a steward. This is not a man who's owning the estate. He's one who's managing it on behalf of his master, on behalf of the man who actually owns it. So this man, there was a rich man who had a manager, and the manager, or the rich man, got news. So charges were brought to him, to the rich man, that this man, the manager, was wasting his possessions. So it's not that he's wasting his own possessions. He is a poor steward. He's not managing well. Now, we do not know, it's not clear in the text, whether he is nefarious, whether he's scheming, whether he's lining his own pockets, or whether he's just slack, whether he's just a wasteful manager and he's doing a poor job. What we do know is he's fired. We'll pick up in verse 2. He called him, the rich man called the manager, and said to him, "What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager." You can no longer be manager. You're fired. You're terminated. You're laid off. Your services are no longer required. However, before you quit and leave, or before you're terminated, there's a final task. I need an accounting. Now, if you and I were to give an accounting, that'd be pretty easy. We just send an Excel spreadsheet, or we give the password to QuickBooks. It's just, you turn it over. Not him. He had to go to all the places where they had accounts, all of the different accounts that this estate owner had in his business, and carried on conversations with each of them to bring every account up to date and to prepare an accounting for it. And so, let's pick back up there in verse 3. And the manager said to himself, "All right, I'm fired. What shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? Well, I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do so that when I'm removed from management, when I'm no longer working here, so that people will receive me into their houses." Well, see, he's in a quandary. He's got no job, not strong enough to dig, ashamed to beg. He needed some way to make sure that he had some place to go, somewhere to work when he left there. He needed to do something to provide for his future. He needed to do something to make sure he was viewed favorably by others. So here was his plan, verse 5. So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, "Take your bill and sit down quick and write 50. Now, let's put this numbers in perspective. He called in all of those who owned his master. And we have two examples, first the oil and then the grain. We'll get to that in just a moment. And so 100 measures of oil is about 875 gallons of olive oil. That's a significant amount. We're talking about a lot of money. And he tells him to reduce the amount that he owes by 50%. So roughly, in today's economy, we're talking about $160,000. And so he cuts the price from 160 down to 80. And then picking up in verse 7, he says to another, "How much do you owe?" He says 100 measures of wheat. 100 measures of wheat is about 1,000 bushels of wheat. He tells him, "Take your bill and write 80. So he gets a 20% discount. Again, these are large numbers. This is a rich man. It's the largest state. The oil would perhaps be the equivalent of about $160,000 today, and he reduced it by half, so $80,000 saved. The wheat would be more, probably $300,000 today, 20% discount, and so that would be $60,000 saved. Now, if you were one of those account holders, how would you feel about this guy? Would you look upon him favorably at this point? And let me just kind of put it in perspective. Most of us are paying a mortgage of some kind. Suppose you were going into the bank to make your monthly mortgage payment. And as you walked into the bank, you were talking to the bank manager, and he says, "Man, I've known you for a long time, and you're a good guy. I like you. You've been faithful to pay regularly. I tell you what, rather than the $250,000 that you owe on your mortgage, we're going to drop this down, and we'll make it $180,000 instead." Is that okay with you? How would you respond? Would you like this guy? You might even put him on your Christmas card list. You would certainly want to take him out to eat or do something to express your appreciation because he has acted favorably for you where he had the authority on behalf of someone else. Now, the parable gets even more confusing for most of us at this point because the master finds out somehow and he doesn't take him to court, or at least not recorded here. Here's how he responds, and it's differently than what we'd anticipate. The next verse, verse 8, the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. He didn't commend what he was doing. It cost the master money, but he's like, that's a pretty smart move on his part. He recognized, of course, that the manager was being clever so that he was providing for his own future. He's not commending the action, to be clear. He is, however, saying that he acted shrewdly. Now Jesus applies it. He takes the story about a master who's just been ripped off by a dishonest manager, and he says to this, and he picks up there at the verse, "For the sons of this world," and that's not us, we're sons of light, "are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light." So what he's saying is these guys whose life is encompassed with simple temporal things, worldly things, things that will pass away, these who cheat and steal, they're giving more thought to getting their objective accomplished. They are more clever, more purposeful, more tactical, more strategic than believers are, than his disciples are, in accomplishing the eternal things that we're supposed to be about. Jesus applying a dishonest manager and says, "Why aren't you more like him?" And that's the next verse. "I tell you, disciples, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth." Now, they value wealth differently than you. We don't serve God and mammon. It's not that wealth is inherently evil. It's just not what we worship. We don't have the same, by the way, if you're here and you're a believer, you don't have the same relationship to the money that you have, that you're responsible for, that a lost person has. Would you agree with that statement? It's a very important truth. We're going to get deeper into that in just a moment. But we can use that wealth, unrighteous wealth, to make friends for ourselves. So that when it fails, and wealth will fail, money will pass away, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Where you will be, they will be. in heaven for eternity. He's applying specifically that they are more clever, astute, shrewd, purposeful than we tend to be when it comes to accomplishing the purpose that God has given to us. Now, we're used to seeing and hearing about things that, while we don't encourage the action, we can recognize the skill that goes into it. This parable has confused a lot of people. It seems on the surface, in a first reading, that Jesus is commending the dishonest steward for being dishonest. Doesn't it kind of seem like that? And yet that's not what he's doing. He's using the cleverness of the dishonest steward, or the slack steward, the wasteful steward, and his preparation for accomplishing his purpose to provide for his own future, his tactical, his shrewdness, his ability to think, plan, and be purposeful. He says, this guy's more purposeful in accomplishing this worldly purpose and selfish purpose than we, who are sons of light, are in accomplishing an eternal purpose, this weight of glory. And so it's an example of cleverness, not commending his dishonesty, but commending, I will say, his intentionality, his processing, his thinking and purpose in what he's accomplishing. We're used to that. We see movies about jailbreaks. We see movies, all kind of things, and stories and even illustrations where there is a characteristic that is brought out of a person that we would not want to follow or to emulate, but we can learn from that characteristic. Jesus is not telling us that we should become worldly minded or crooked. He's stating the obvious fact that in worldly matters, worldly people often show more astuteness, shrewdness, planning, intentionality, and purpose than God's children do in matters of eternal significance. Does that make sense? Are you with me so far? Is Jesus saying you should be a wasteful manager? Clearly not. As a matter of fact, as we go on through the passage, you'll see that we're to be faithful in small things and faithful in large things. That we cannot serve God and mammon or unrighteous wealth. We don't serve unrighteous wealth. We allow it, recognizing it's not ours, to be served for the purpose of God. He goes on in verse 10, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. And that's self-evident. You do what you do because you are what you are. Does that make sense? The way you behave with what you have now, whether it be little or whether it not be as much as you hope it will be in the future, is how you will behave with the resources that you have in the future. Because our behavior is determined by what's taking place in our heart. Verse 11, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? How you handle temporal things, worldly things, are indicative of how you are handling and will handle eternal things, things that matter for eternity. Verse 13, if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, stewardship, who will give you then that which is your own? And that's speaking of eternal rewards. We'll get more into that as we go later through this series. And then verse 13, no servant can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. He's repeating the lesson that he taught on the Sermon on the Mount. And so he's not saying that we should mimic the unrighteous behavior that's found in this passage by this manager, but he is saying that we should be tactical and thoughtful and clever. We should be planning and purposeful, endeavoring with our minds in a way that helps us to accomplish a long-term goal with strategic short-term steps, and it's about eternal issues. He went back and said that they may greet you when you enter into eternity. And so I want to take a few moments to talk now about observations from this parable and the applications for it, because this is a really kind of weird text. How are we taught to relate to money? Should we judge or develop our friendships based upon how much money somebody has? You can ask James. James says, listen, he was calling out the church there. He said, you guys gather to worship, and if somebody comes in and they're dressed well and they look nice and they got money, you give them the best seats. Somebody less wealthy, somebody in less good shape, you sit in the corner. It's ungodly. We treat every person the same, regardless of their income, regardless of their wealth. What about gain, personal gain? Are we to be more favorable toward those who are more generous to us? You remember in Philippians chapter 4, the church at Philippi gave Paul an offering. And Paul said, I am so grateful for your offering because it enhances the furtherance of the gospel. But I'm grateful mostly because it goes to your credit that you're engaged. He says, for myself, whether I have a lot or whether I have nothing. Whether there is surplus or whether there is an absence, I've learned to be content. Why? Because of God's provision. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so we don't relate to each other. We are not to. We do sometimes, but we should not. We are never called to relate to each other based upon finances or wealth or someone's generosity to us or that sort of thing. How does the world work? How does the world work? Those who are not sons of light, but those who are sons of darkness. Now, before we get too much into that, I think one of the things that he's saying here and one of the applications we can take is there may be thieves out there who are planning bank robberies and things like that, who are more tactical and purposeful and shrewd in doing evil than we are in doing the things that glorify God. I think that in some cases, particularly when it comes to the matters of eternity, we are the wasteful stewards. We're just slack. We're the wasteful steward before you got fired, and we don't accomplish what God would have us to do. And this is the call to, hey, wake up, be purposeful, and be intentional. And that's the first point I want you to make on your outline. We'll just start there. We are to live purposefully. And you can use the word cleverly. You can use the word shrewdly, whatever word you like. Intentionally. We are to be fully engaged in making disciples. And you may say, well, why making disciples? I don't see making disciples in this text. Well, it's because we're stewards. We're no longer our own. We've been bought with a price, and God has given us a mission. He's given us a commission. He sent us to go and make disciples. And that's what we spent the last 4 weeks teaching about and studying in Luke chapter 15 and prior to that, where we have a mission as a congregation. We are under orders, and our mission is to glorify God and to be obedient to Him in all that we do and to fulfill the task that He has given to us. Excuse me. Of making disciples. He is rebuking His disciples. You're a steward, here's your job. Make disciples. Even when Jesus called the first disciples, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. And so our evaluation is, are we utilizing everything, the resources that God has given to us that we steward for Him to make disciples? And in this parable and in this teaching, He's talking about one particular aspect of stewardship, and that's money. And don't you love it when the preacher talks about money? Oh, I can't believe I came on Money Day. Yes, you braved whatever you had to brave to get here today to hear about money. Now, it's going to be a little bit different application of money. Because this deals with, Jesus says, use unrighteous wealth to make friends for eternal reasons. And so we need to recognize that how we manage money matters. Would you agree with that? How we manage whatever resources, little or much, we'll get to verse 10, little or much, how we manage the resources that God has given to us matters. And so even in the arena of our personal expenses, I'm going to go through this quickly, even in the arena of our personal expenses, we need to ask the question, am I spending these resources in a way that glorifies God and makes disciples? Buying this house. Is this house going to help? How is this house going to help me make disciples? Should I buy a house in another place? Should I buy a less expensive house? Should I buy a house that's more expensive in an area to give me a mission field to reach with the resources that God has provided sufficiently? How will this house help me make disciples? What about this car? What about this vehicle I drive? Can a car help you make disciples? Can a car... I mean, you can pick people up and bring them to church. Many of you already do. Can you use this as a resource? This is a resource that God has given to you in the disciple-making process. How about technology? Is this technology going to help me make disciples? The things that I buy, the things that I do. We need to be eternally minded and think often of what is coming and store up treasures in heaven. But beyond simple our own personal expenses and using these resources that too often we think of as ours, we need to have an external focus. And I believe this is what Jesus was meant when He said in verse 9, I tell you to make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, the unrighteous wealth will fail, that they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. I think He's telling us that we need to employ the power of generosity, that we are to be recognizing the character of Christ and reflecting His character. We are to be people who are generous, not simply to one another, but as a means of displaying the love and the character of the generous God that we serve. Amen? Are you generous people? Are you generous people? Generosity is powerful. And the way of the world, we've already learned that we have a different relationship with money than a lost person does, right? But the way of the world is different. Generosity shows some things it has power. It shows some things to the people in the world. And so I've got 3 subpoints. I want to run through these really quick. But generosity shows that you value the recipient. Generosity, when you are generous to someone, it demonstrates to them, hey, this person likes me. They value me. They at least value me more than the thing that they gave me because they let go of it and turned it over to me. We see this in Proverbs 18:16, where it says, a man's gift makes room for him and brings him before the great. Generosity makes room for you in somebody's heart. Would you agree with that? Just the next chapter over, Proverbs 19:6 says, many seek the favor of a generous man, and everyone is a friend to a man who gives gifts. Would you believe that, right? I mean, we just see it again and again. We have it in our own experience. We have it in the world around us. And Jesus says, make friends. Does this sound weird to us? Make friends by the use of your money that God has entrusted to you, His money that you have control over. You're to use that to make friends for the spread of the gospel, which means that you're generous, and it's perceived as generosity, and it's not manipulation, because love is acting for the highest good and the best for someone else. And so it becomes another arsenal in our toolbox, if you will. It becomes another way that God empowers us to establish friendship. Who can you share the gospel with effectively? Someone who is your friend. Someone who knows you value them, correct? Don't go to sleep yet. Yes? And is generosity a way that you can develop a friendship and demonstrate that you value someone else and provides a hearing for the gospel? I believe, again, I know many of you, I know the expressions of your life that we are generous people. But I think that maybe we need to be more generous. I think that we need to view our generosity, get this, I think that we need to view our generosity as a vehicle or a means by which we can establish relationships to gain a hearing for the gospel. And can I just be really practical here? When you go out to eat, you ought to tip generously. Now, every time I say that, I get pushback, but I don't care. I'm going to tell you, I think if you can't afford to tip well, you can't afford to eat out. When you sit at a table and your server comes up and they have to wait on you because you are saying the blessing over the food that God's provided, and you are mean-spirited, and you are stingy and not gracious when you tip, what kind of demonstration of gospel? And I don't know about you guys, but Suzanne and I, we like going to the same places. They're not I say the same places. We like going again and again and again to the same places that we like to go. We don't necessarily like to go to the same places. We go together. Okay. Let me explain what I mean. I'm more Waffle House. She's more Cracker Barrel. All right? Does that make sense? I'm more Waffle House. She's more Cracker Barrel. But we get habituated to going to the same place. And we ask the name of the person who brings us food. My favorite people bring me food. So I like people that bring me food. All right? And so we want to carry on a conversation and we want to establish relationships. But even if it's just one time in and one time out, I want to be a witness. You go to church, you go to a restaurant after church on Sunday. I don't know if you're going to do that today or not. But if you go to a restaurant after church on Sunday and you're dressed in your Sunday clothes, what does your behavior, including what you leave and what you pay for, testify about the character of Christ if you're His representative? Doesn't that matter? It matters. Now, that's just one small example. You ought to be. Here's an example from this week. It's okay for you to take a roll of toilet paper out of your shopping cart and put it into somebody else's. Okay? And just say, and you just use it. Look, I'm not worried about this because I'm trusting God who's in control to provide for my needs. Here, let me do you some good. Is that silly? But isn't it just practical? A demonstration of kindness, a demonstration of generosity, a way to show people that you value them. And it's also easier to give when we recognize that what we're giving is not ours in the first place. Isn't that right? I remember when I was in college, I would come home and sometimes I would need money, and I would ask Dad for money. And Dad, when he was able, would say, "Here, son, here's you some money." And I remember one Sunday, came home. Dad was a pastor at Gear Memorial Baptist Church in Easley. I was home from college. He gave me some money that I could take back to school and cover some expenses while I was at school, but I didn't do that. We went out with a group of kids and friends after church on Sunday night, and I picked up the tab for everybody. And I got home, and we were talking about it, and when I told Dad that's what I did, he was not happy. He said, "Son, I want you to be a generous person, but not with my money. You be generous with your money." And so it's okay if you decide to take those resources and spend them unwisely in this fashion because it's not in your budget, but that's all the money you get. I'm not going to replenish your fund because it's you being generous. You understand the difference? Now, here's what I discovered and what I've learned. It's always easier to spend somebody else's money. Don't you know that? It's always easier to spend somebody else's money. One of the things that will help us be generous is for us to recognize it's not my money. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and all they that dwell therein. Job 41 says everything on the earth, everything that lives and breathes, and everything that does not live and breathe, everything animate and inanimate belongs to God. Jesus, you don't have anything that you did not receive. This is Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. You don't have anything that you did not receive, therefore why boast as if you had received it? Jesus, Matthew chapter 10, as you have therefore received, therefore so freely give. I want you to understand that we are stewards of what God has entrusted to us. And in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17 through 19, to read the longer passage, Paul is talking to Timothy about how to deal with money, how to think about money. And he says, "As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty or proudful, not to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches. We know that riches will fail, but rather set your hope on God who does what? Richly provides us with everything to enjoy. Now they're to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous, ready to share." And there's an end result. They're storing up treasures for themselves as a good foundation for the future so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. And that leads us to the third subpoint under number 2. When you're generous, you're demonstrating faith that God's going to meet your needs, that God's going to provide for you. It is His resources I want to give in a way that gives glory to Him, and He faithfully provides for me to give. Even in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 8 and 9, where Paul is collecting an offering, and he's talking about them giving cheerfully. He says, "And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work." Who's responsible for giving you the resources that you need to abound in every good work? God is. How do you do that? When you're faithful in little, God increases that, and you're faithful in much. As it is written, He has distributed freely, He has given to the poor, His righteousness endures forever. And so the third point, and I don't have time. We won't get to this today, but we'll at least take a stab at it. We need to be faithful in the little things, where you are today. Now, let me be abundantly clear here in this sermon on money, this teaching that Jesus has for this unjust parable. The first thing that He's saying is, number one, we need to be intentional and purposeful in the task he's given to us, which is making disciples. You need to plan it as though like a thief plans a bank robbery. You need to be careful. We need to be careful and intentional in accomplishing our, not slack, not wasteful, not just coasting along, but engaged. Part of that is using and engaging the power that comes with generosity. We have a generous God, and we're to use the financial resources that he has given to us to make friends for yourself. Why? Because friends are open to the gospel. They are more likely to allow you the opportunity to present the gospel. It demonstrates the value that you place upon them. It gives you a hearing for them. It demonstrates your own recognition that it's not your resources in the first place, and that God has promised to provide for your needs, and that God will continue to provide for your needs and increase those things moving forward. And where do you start? You start with where you are. Whatever it is, in the little areas. This is not subscription to a church budget. This is not funding a ministry plan. This is, guys, view your money as a means by which Jesus intends for you to develop relationships for eternity. Relationships that will matter for eternity. Simple truth, right? Easy to talk about here. It's something that we need to put in practice. Let me tell you what we need to stop doing. We need to stop keeping score. Who's done what for me so I can do it back to them, and not any more, not any less. We need to stop hoarding resources. And the way that, by the way, just a quick word to those of you who own businesses and do sales and conduct businesses. If the way that you conduct business, negotiate contracts, make sales, customer service, if the way that you conduct business does not encourage that person to be open to you talking to them about the gospel, then you're not doing it right. You're not doing it in a way that glorifies God. You're not doing it in a way that reflects his character. And so every aspect of what we do, we need to be thinking, how does this make disciples? How does this glorify God and make disciples in my life? And this isn't just, again, funding a ministry. This is in the expression of my life and the resources that God has trusted to me. Isn't God good? I love this. He's given us resources, and he tells us what to do with it. And what he's telling us this morning is that even the money in your bank and the money in your pocket, the resources that he has given to you, is something that he intends for you to use to be generous to others so that you can gain a hearing for the gospel and demonstrate the generosity of a God who loved us so much that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but should have everlasting life. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for the parable of this steward who was shrewd in accomplishing his objective. Father, may we be no less shrewd in accomplishing ours. Not coming up with our own cleverness and designs, but being intelligent by seeking your word and by being intentional and learning your principles and putting them into place with planning and intent and intention and purposefulness. Father, will you help us to be generous stewards? Will you help us to recognize that our purpose isn't to accumulate funds. Our purpose is to recognize that they're your funds that need to be invested in things that will last for eternity, that we are to store up treasure in heaven where moth and rust does not corrupt and no thief takes away. Father, I pray that you will help us to recognize the purpose and the intent of the resources that you have given to us. We love you. We thank you. In your name I pray. Amen.